Peace and blessings, dear FBA family and friends. And as always, I see some enemies. I am your brother and your host, Dr. Muhammad. And you're tuned into the Dr. Muhammad Files, where we break down the real issues of the FBA community in a scholarly, civil, and unapologetically truthful way. So, welcome to episode 5 of our series. Today, we dive into chapter 5 of Dr. Feagin's powerful and essential work titled Black Action Accelerating Freedom, Justice, and Democracy. The 1700s and 1800s is what the chapter 5 is entitled. So in this chapter, Dr. Feagin, he explores the extensive and often overlooked efforts of foundational black Americans to achieve freedom and social justice throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. His analysis centers on the organized resistance to systemic oppression, resistance that was both widespread and deeply rooted in the black American experience. While much of this story has been marginalized or even forgotten, recent scholarship by historians and civil rights organizations has begun to bring these stories back into the light. In fact, I'm reading a new book entitled Black Cowboys. I may do a commentary on that or just kind of talk to the community about it, but it's a really interesting synopsis of Black Cowboys and how we've gotten away from the history of Black Cowboys. But I digress. Dr. Feagin in this piece highlights both violent and non-violent forms of resistance. Enslaved foundational black American engaged in direct physical defiance. They don't tell you about this. They tell you about how docile the Negroes were, right? That we were destroying crops, tools, livestock, and property, and at times confronting the overseers and enslavers with force. So, alongside this, FBA also practiced subtle nonviolent resistance. For example, slowing their work pace, faking illness, and organizing strikes. These acts, millions in numbers, right? We don't hear about this, but there were millions of acts of rebellion that represented a sustained challenge to white colonial domination and control. So now let's address a long-standing myth. What's the myth? That the whitewash narrative of the contingent slave or the docile slave has been deeply embedded in American culture, circulated for generations through films, textbooks, and mainstream media. Sadly, this distorted image, it still holds sway in many minds today. Every time they talk about the enslaved foundational black Americans, they say it in the framework of we were docile Negroes who didn't protest our enslavement. But Dr. Feagin, he confronts this head on. He points to a telling example from the 1800s when Harvard historian James Scholer echoed the dominant white framing of the time. Scholer, he described enslaved black people using deeply racist and dehumanizing language, calling them docile, childlike, imitators, and non-moralists, even labeling them a servile race. This is how they framed foundational black Americans who were enslaved. That was obedient. They said we were obedient to the whip or the whoop. That's where we get the word whoop from, the whip, because the slave masters would whip us. It's where you get the word cracker from. Some people think it's from the saltine crackers. We get the cracker, the derogatory term cracker of white folks from the whipping, the cracking of the whip from the overseers. So these were not just personal opinions, they reflected a broader centuries old ideology used to justify slavery and erase black resistance because they've documented our black resistance, but they've tried to erase it over the years. But the truth is far different. Most enslaved people were not docile Negroes. They resisted in every way they could, physically, spiritual, spiritually, and strategically. Always, always, FBA family, friends, and yes, you enemies, always seeking freedom, even under the harshest conditions. Let's get into it.
Brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. In fact, I'm a black nationalist freedom fighter. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro into the community, get you and me to support him so he can use him to lead us astray, those days are long gone.
All right, so I had to adjust my lighting and my sound. Hopefully, both are better. So before we get started, FBA family, friends, and enemies, I always give this caveat or disclaimer before I start, or not always, but while I'm doing a podcast, doing a commentary, I want to make something clear for our listeners. Throughout this podcast, I'll be citing the work of Dr. Feagin and other so called white liberal scholars. You'll notice that some of them still use the outdated and inaccurate misnomer of African American. I will only use this label when quoting them directly. Many of us in the foundational black American community do not identify as African. I talked about this in my earlier podcast. For example, my lineage traces back to here. We have pictures of my great great grandmother on the reservations, um, and so we do not ascribe to being strictly from Africa. Africa. Some of our ancestors were here prior to slavery and mixed with those Africans. Some of us, not all of us, who came here mixed with the red natives. And I gave a couple um, podcasts on this. And also in my dissertation, I talked significantly about who are foundational black Americans or freedmen. And that distinction matters. But anyway, so wartime action against slavery is the name of this chapter or this section of the chapter. So let's now turn to the role of wartime in the fight against slavery. Dr. Joe Feagin, he highlights how even before the United States officially came into being in the 1780s, again, our people were here. Many foundational black Americans were already taking bold steps toward freedom. And before there was a United States of America, before there was even a conception of a United States of America, my people personally were here in this country. So we foundational black Americans during that time often used the chaos of war as an opportunity to escape enslavement. Dr. Feagin writes, in the decades before the official emergence of the United States in the 1780s, many African Americans sought their freedom by fleeing enslavement, which was often facilitated by U.S. war settings. They were anything but contented in docile stereotypes of white imagination. Feagin continues, for several decades now, historians have recorded that During the American Revolution, far more enslaved African Americans sought out their liberty by fleeing and fighting for the British side than by fighting for the American side. This large number was a significant percentage of those enslaved, and it included many enslaved by Thomas Jefferson and then General George Washington. Yes, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, for those who don't know or try to hide history, enslaved people, enslaved uh, black melanated individuals. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, many of us know, had relationships and children with some of those black enslaved women. So Dr. Feagin also he reminds us of the contradictions embedded in American symbols. Recall too, he says, that Francis Scott Key, a white slave owner who during this war wrote the Star Spangled Banner with its numerous lines about fictitious land of the free. Yeah, a family, how can we have the land of the free? And you had a significant number of the population enslaved. He says, consider the new nation a legitimate white slave holding republic. Moreover, in that anthem's seldom sung third verse, Key verbally attacked those enslaved Americans who courageously fought with the British for their liberty. Excuse me. Feagin concludes with a powerful reflection. He says, such rarely acknowledged historical events signal that this country's whites are still unwilling to face its enslavement foundations, right? Because the foundation of America was built off black Americans and enslavement. He says that the African Americans have long resisted that racial oppression and actively sought opportunities to create freedom for themselves. So, family, friends, and enemies, these wartime acts of resistance often erase, right, or downplayed, reveal a powerful truth that enslaved foundational black Americans were never passive, docile participants in their own oppression. As Dr. Feagin makes clear, they seized every opportunity, even in the chaos of war, to fight for their freedom. And yet, the dominant narratives have long ignored this reality, preferring myths over the uncomfortable truth of America's founding. We're going to keep it a buck here. So, as the fight for freedom unfolded on the battlefields, another powerful form of resistance was taking shape through the written words. Dr. Feagin highlights how foundational black Americans, both enslaved and free, turned to petitions, right, as a formal and courageous means of protest. He writes, another major type of protest action by African Americans involved the filing of important petitions for freedom and against slavery. The first of these petitions was filed in 1773, well before the white elite's Declaration of Independence, by enslaved blacks in an organized effort in the Massachusetts colony. They described described enslaved lives as quite embittered with this most intolerable reflection of never being able to possess or enjoy anything, no, not even life itself. So these early petitions were not isolated acts, FBA family, friends, and you enemies. They marked the beginning of a sustained legal and moral challenge to the institution of slavery. So Feagin continues, after the creation of the United States, these petitions continued at state and federal level, and white political leaders routinely rejected them. Interesting. They didn't want freedom for everyone. He continues, in one 1799 petition to the President, Senate, and House Representatives, 70 free black Philadelphians protested aspects of the implementation of the inhumane fugitive slave law. They emphasized their natural right to liberty as described in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution's preamble. So these petitions, it reveals a deep understanding and conceptualization of the nation's founding ideals, and a bold insistence that those ideals be extended to all people, not just the white elite. They also highlight the strategic brilliance of black resistance using the very language, right, of white America democracy to expose its hypocrisy and contradictions. So, next we turn to the lived realities behind this legal efforts in our next section entitled Individual and Collective Battles for Liberty. Here we'll explore how black Americans, through both solidarity acts and organized movements, continue to resist bondage and claim their freedom, often at great peril and risk. So, beyond petitions and legal appeals, the fight for freedom took shape in deeply personal and often perilous ways. Enslaved foundational black Americans were not merely victims of a brutal system, they were among the most determined freedom fighters in the U.S. history. And I talk about the Maroons, um, and I talk about all of the different foundational black Americans who resisted in the form of warfare. And Dr. Feagin powerfully states, historically, enslaved African Americans have been among the foremost freedom fighters this country has produced. So their resistance, FBA's resistance, was not only physical, but it was also intellectual, emotional, and spiritually rooted in a deep belief in their right to live free as any human being would. So Feagin continues, the autobiographical accounts of those enslaved reveal U.S. slavery as an institutionalized system of racial oppression undergirded by routine violence and the socially sanctioned coercive or sadistic inclinations of many whites. There are many examples of enslaved individuals seeking the liberation from enslavement's many types of everyday torture. One dramatic example is given in his autobiography by the great abolitionist and civil rights leader Frederick Douglass. At one point in 1833, during his teenage years of enslavement, Douglass decided to resist openly and with all necessary violence the recurring white attempts to violently subordinate him. So, Frederick Douglass's story is just one, family, friends, and enemies among countless others. There are countless others and well documented stories of people who risk everything to reclaim their humanity. These acts of resistance from these freedom fighters, whether through escape, rebellion, or confrontation, were not just isolated. They were part of a broader tradition of black defiance and self determination. And you have now the continental African and Caribbeans, not to beat up on them, trying to create the narrative that we got our resistance from them when we know historically that we were resisting long before, for example, the Haiti Revolutionary War. So Dr. Feagin, he concludes this section with a powerful reminder. He says, given the opportunity, enslaved black men and women exercised their agency and openly fought for their liberty, sometimes meeting slavery's violence with liberatory violence. They held strongly to a black counterframing, insisting on the right of those oppressed to use any means at their disposal. Unmistakably, the leaders of these revolts took seriously the principle of real liberty and justice. Um, I was trying to think of the Dismal Swamp and all of the rebellions, the Stoner Rebellion. There are many, many historical rebellions, revolts, and acts of resistance in the foundational Black American community. So these individual and collective acts of resistance, it laid the groundwork for even larger uprisings to come, uprisings that would shake the very foundations of the slaveholding South, like the Nat Turner Rebellion. So up next, we talk about the bold and often bloody confrontations in our next section, called the Black Rebellions in the Civil War era. We'll look at how enslaved and free Black people organized, resisted, and rebelled during one of the most transformative periods in American history. So, as the Civil War unfolded, Black resistance entered a new and transformative phase. The Civil War, not only destabilized the Southern slave economy, but it also opened up new pathways for enslaved Black people to assert their agency and fight for liberation on a massive scale. Dr. Joe Feagin highlights this pivotal moment, writing, by 1863, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in January and some Union military victories in the South had emboldened many enslaved Black families to increase their protest activity. That is, to empower themselves by means of escapes, employment, enlistment, and education. So, family, friends, and enemies, and I always include the enemies because they're always in the comment section and they're always trying to cause disruption as usual. The devil will devil, right? This surge in self liberation was not spontaneous, it was actually strategic. Enslaved people recognize, right, the shifting tides of war, and they seized the moment to act. We were never. I want you to, if you don't take anything away from this, family, friends, and enemies too, I want you to understand this. We were not docile. No, are we docile Negroes? We will resist. In fact, and Tariq Nasheed talks about this often. We are the only people who have consistently and continue to fight global white supremacy. Period. Point blank. There is no uh, discrepancy or there is no denying that. So their resistance, FBA family, friends, and enemies, FBA's resistance, it took many forms. Leaving the plantations, joining the Union forces, seeking education, and building new lives in the midst of chaos. This caused the Southern collapse, right? Along with the fighting. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, as we all know, he said the war itself would not have been won had it not been for foundational Black Americans joining the Union Army and fighting. This is history, FBA family. So Feagin, he also draws on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois to describe this mass movement as he called it a general strike, a coordinated withdrawal of labor and loyalty from the Confederate economy. He writes, Dr. Feagin, this general strike of laborers and their families had dramatic impact on this country and its future. It was a rebellion not just of individuals but of entire communities, reshaping the course of the war and the nation itself. So these acts of rebellion, both quiet and overt, were not just reactions to oppression, but they were declarations of our humanity, dignity, and the right to self-determination. They remind us that the Civil War was not only a battle between the North and the South. This is how most white scholars framed the Civil War. This was between the North and the South. The North wanted to free the slaves, which we know is not true. But it was also a revolution from below. What do I mean? What do we mean by led by below? From those resistance fighters who not only fought in the Union but also were rebelling in other ways, as we just laid out. It led in large part by those. It was led, I should say, by large part by those who had the most to gain and the most to lose, foundational Black Americans. So, as we close this exploration of Black resistance across centuries, we turn now to our final reflections. In our concluding segment, we'll consider the enduring legacy of these struggles and what they continue to teach us about freedom, justice, and the unfinished work of democracy in America. So, in conclusion, FBA family, friends, and the enemies that are still lurking, as we've journeyed through the pages of Dr. Feagin, Black Action, Accelerating Freedom, Justice, and Democracy, one truth becomes undeniable. The struggle for Black liberation in America has always and will continue to be active, intentional, and deeply rooted in resistance. So, from the earliest petitions against enslavement to the courageous individuals and collective battles for liberty, and through the powerful rebellions of the Civil War era, the Maroons, the Dismal Swamp, the Stony Rebellion, Nat Turner, foundational Black Americans have consistently, again, as I said earlier, we have been the only ones who have consistently fought global white supremacy and challenged the systems that sought to dehumanize not only us, but all others. And this is why when there's something that happens, they come to foundational Black Americans for their stamp of approval, like the Israel Palestine issue, like the immigration. They want foundational Black Americans to help because we have the only moral high ground, and quite frankly, we are the only ones who are fighting global white supremacy. Even right now, you don't hear them talking about how white supremacy is behind some of the things that are going on, right? They just want FBAs to go out there and fight. But as Dr. Feagin reminds us, these were not just isolated acts of defiance. They were part of a long, interconnected tradition of Black agency, vision, courage, resistance. These stories help to disrupt the myth of passivity and contentment that have long been used to distort U.S. history by mostly white scholars. They remind us that the fight for freedom was not granted from above, it was demanded, seized, and defended from below those freedom fighters who were resisting in all the rebellions. And so, as we close this episode, family, friends, and enemies, we honor the legacy of those who resisted, who dreamed, and who acted. Their voices echo through time, calling us not only to remember, but to continue. This is important. We have to continue the work of justice, truth telling, and liberation of our people, foundational Black Americans. Once we get the liberation of foundational Black Americans, maybe we can help others. But we need to be codified. That is, the FBA community needs to be codified and resist as we have been. So the fight for FBA recognition is far from over, but through education, activism, and self-determination, we will reclaim our rightful place in history. We are reclaiming our rightful place in history. Our ancestors built this nation brick by brick, law by law, institution by institution. And now it is our duty to secure the justice, wealth, and legacy that they were denied. Therefore, the future of foundational Black American empowerment is in our hands. And together, we will reshape it. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the truth and chart the path forward. So please like this podcast, subscribe, share it, and comment below. If you want to, you can also donate to my nonprofit charity called BAFLA, or Black American Freedmen Future Leaders of America. Signing off, your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad, and these are the Dr. Muhammad Files.